Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Klitzman. I am the director of the Masters of Bioethics Program here at Columbia, and we're thrilled to welcome you and to welcome Vardit Ravitsky, the new president of the Hastings Center, in what should be a wonderful and fascinating evening. Vardit was previously a professor at the Bioethics Program in the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal, and a part-time senior lecturer on global health and social medicine at Harvard. She is truly global. She received her PhD from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, her master's from the University of New Mexico, and her bachelor's degree from the Sorbonne in Paris. She has been president of the International Association of Bioethics. She has had many important positions, both in Canada and in the United States, on advisory boards. She's published widely on artificial intelligence and bioethics most recently, but also on a range of other important topics. And it is great that the Hastings Center has had the wisdom to choose her as their new president. She will be talking to us today and with us about the future of bioethics, challenges, visions, and opportunities. And we see this as an interactive session. So please feel free to put questions or comments at any point in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to answer and respond, or have Vardit answer and respond to as many as possible. So without further ado, Vardit, thank you so much again, and welcome to everyone.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'm really excited to join you this evening. I think this is my first official talk in my new role, so this is very timely. I received permission from the editor of the Hastings Center report to plug in. Sorry, are you seeing now the essay?
We are.
Okay, great. I was invited to write an essay in the Hastings Center report to launch a conversation around the vision that I hope we will all be discussing regarding the future of bioethics. It's coming out very soon in the September-October issue. And when I started discussing this piece with some people around me, Eric Parents, Greg Kebnick, Joe Fins, I thought of calling it Bioethics 3.0. And the idea behind the metaphor was that if we look at the history of bioethics since its inception in the 60s, when the Hastings Center took an active and critical part in kicking off the field, we can see sort of two stages that I was trying to describe as bioethics 1.0 and 2.0, and that it's time for us now to move towards 3.0. And the reason I'm telling the story, it ended up not being the metaphor that I use in the essay. I hope I'm making you curious to read it, and that you'll go and find it when it's published soon. But one of the reasons I abandoned this metaphor is that when I tried to describe the history of bioethics, any person who read the draft was triggered to react and say, oh, but that's not how I see it. My history of bioethics has, 5 stages or 1 stage. And for me, the transitions are from this to that and the other. So I realized that if my essay focuses on the history of bioethics, it will launch a discussion, probably a very passionate one, but about the past. And I want to talk about the future. So the title at the end is a title that focuses on the future of bioethics, just like the talk tonight. But I do want to say just 2 words about where we have been as a preparation for where are we going. Just to recognize that in the 60s and the 70s, we were a nascent field led by philosophers and theologians, focusing on the protection of individuals from powerful and often paternalistic systems. I think we can all agree on that. And then in the 80s and 90s, we became an increasingly diverse field. Many more types of scholars were invited into the conversation, but the core of our interest remained individuals and their autonomy. Then in subsequent years, we started putting greater emphasis on more diverse methodologies, such as empirical bioethics. We saw emerging specializations within our fields, such as neuroethics, or my field, reproductive ethics. And we started developing more nuanced theoretical tools, such as relational accounts of autonomy. However, with this growing diversity and richness, methodological and topical, the ongoing emphasis, I think, globally speaking, remained on individual autonomy. And you may disagree, but I'd like to argue that we gave historically inadequate attention to the fact that issues related to the common good are just as relevant to health and well-being as those related to individual interests. So I'm asking us to pause for a second, look at this history. We're now many decades old. We have evolved, we have changed. I would argue we have expanded and enriched. But I think this is a very interesting time to ask ourselves, should bioethics reposition itself? And maybe the first question to ask is, why now? First and foremost, lessons from the pandemic. We're emerging from one of, once in a generation or more global crisis that taught us a lot about what it means to face collective level challenges. And I think it shed an interesting light on our strengths, what we brought to the conversation and even to the management of the pandemic response, and our, well, not weaknesses, some gaps and opportunities for improvement. I think why now? Because we're facing existential and global threats, for example, climate change. We're coming to terms with the tragic, terrible impacts of inequity, locally and globally. We're facing a world that is more and more polarized. We're having a more difficult time even having conversation across value systems, not to mention the impact that AI is starting to have and will continue to have on healthcare systems, on our lives in every way. And of course, the continued emergence of biotechnologies, genomics technologies, neurotechnologies that are changing the way we think about health or even about being human. So I think there's a growing recognition now in light of all these things of, first of all, the relevance of bioethics, how important bioethics principles are to anything from public health to the integration of AI into healthcare, and also growing recognition of the gaps in our scholarship and impact. I think we're seeing more clearly where we can do better. So my first argument is now is a good time to consider the repositioning of bioethics. When I've been talking about this with many colleagues over the last few years, and I'd like to present something that I call the scope debate. Some colleagues have argued that if we expand bioethics further in the way that I'm about to present to you as my vision, we face the risk of diluting our expertise and becoming less effective. They have argued that we have spent decades now building an expertise, honing tools, and becoming really good at addressing issues at the level of patient care, healthcare delivery, emerging biotechnologies, biomedical research, and the policies that govern all of these. My counter argument has been that we need to expand, or rather continue to expand, in order to do timely and needed work. And I'm grounding this actually in the notion that this goes back to our origins, that this is not a new thought, but rather invigorating insights that were eclipsed early in our history, such as Callahan's, one of the founders of the Hastings Center, Callahan's vision of the common good, Potter's ecological and global bioethics, Jonas's notion of responsibility for the whole of nature and future generations. So these more collective and ecological visions were there, but bioethics took a turn towards a more healthcare and patient and research participants focused exploration. And I'm almost trying to argue that we need to get back on our original track. So I want to discuss a possible future for our field that continues our evolution to become a field that embraces systemic collective level challenges, that has a global scale and focus, that emphasizes human flourishing, and that seeks to have increased societal impact. And I'll of course dive deep into each of them. Now, I don't offer this vision because I think it's the only one, or because I am foolish enough to believe that there are no good counter arguments to each of my points. There are. But I would like to invite an open and wide-ranging conversation about the future of bioethics, precisely because I think it's the right time to ask how are we going to position ourselves in light of the coming challenges, those of the coming years. So I want to suggest a path forward and outward that focuses on 5 sort of dimensions, from individual to collective level issues, from local to global, from human health to human flourishing, from scholarship to impact, from a field to a hub. For each of these, when I say from to, I don't mean that we're going to abandon the important work that we have done, for example, at the individual level, at the local level, in relation to human health. I'm talking about expansion and the inclusion of further themes, approaches, making our view, our mission even wider. So what I want to do until we get to our discussion, Bob, is to just say a few words about each of these to feed into what I hope will be this evening a conversation where you agree with me, disagree with me, offer great arguments that I didn't think about, offer further nuance or examples. So let's start with from the individual level to the collective. I don't think this is a point that anybody would disagree with, because as I said, when we look at our history, we acknowledge that we have focused on the individual level to a great degree, and we created wonderful tools, principles, policies, frameworks to address the protection of patients and research participants. But I think that we also started moving towards acknowledging that these individuals that we tried so hard to protect are embedded within familial, cultural, organizational, societal contexts that must be considered. I think we started looking at the ethical dimensions of social determinants of health and health disparities. We recognize that resource allocation challenges are not just at the level of which individual will get a kidney or a ventilator, but are rather present at every aspect and every level of healthcare, at the more systemic level, at the collective level. And I think we also started acknowledging that the conceptual tools we developed to date for addressing these issues of justice, fairness, and equity are underdeveloped and need to become more sophisticated. I think we're, especially in the US, recognizing that the focus on negative rights and the protection of individuals cannot stand without an attention to positive rights and what we owe each other, amongst other things, the right to healthcare. I even think that in the context of research ethics, we were focused in the past on protection of participants from exploitation, but then we moved already about 20 years ago to talking about the right to be included in research, and then even the notion of solidarity as underlying a possible responsibility to participate in research. So I think the focus, for the transition from the individual to the collective is already happening, and COVID-19 really brought home this message that we need to work on public health ethics, because the principles that we were in the process of developing were needed daily when we faced all these tensions between individual freedoms and the common good. We had to cope with lockdowns, curfews, school closures, vaccine mandates. Bob and I are part of the Association of Bioethics Program Directors. We coped with this daily during the pandemic in terms of what bioethics principles help us provide good arguments for the public and for policymakers within that tension. I think we need more work in that space. And of course, theories of justice and resource allocation were needed when we were discussing triage protocols. vaccine priorities within nations, and of course, global vaccine inequity. So the pandemic really brought home the extent to which we need to develop further all the tools and all the theories at the collective level. I think bioethics contributed a lot during the pandemic, but the crisis also exposed the gaps and the opportunities we have for moving further in that direction. From local to global. Here again, we can't start talking about this without noting at least that the pandemic was a moment of reckoning with how national borders epidemiologically make no sense, and that we're really a global village. But other challenges are coming our way that highlight the world as an interconnected entity. For example, digital economy, artificial intelligence. The implementation of certain new technologies is going to impact us on the global level. If we try to address these challenges locally, we will not be effective. That is the argument I'm trying to propose. Beyond the empirical changes that are coming our way, I think we are also recognizing the normative concepts of global justice, equity, solidarity, and the notion that there are things we owe each other as human beings, not just as belonging to the same local collective. So I'm proposing that we need to move beyond the values of individuals or even the values of different communities and cultures to values that potentially underlie a truly global bioethics. And I'm not preaching for ethical relativism, but I am saying that this will force us to take diversity very seriously. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we live in a Western liberal democracy, and we're going to, offer patients care that is culturally sensitive. It's another thing to sit around a truly global table with people and communities that profoundly disagree regarding your worldview and try to work together to address issues. I was until recently the president of the International Association of Bioethics, and it was under my presidency that the next location of the World Congress of Bioethics was selected, and that is Qatar, Doha in Qatar. And we have been seriously criticized for this choice. We have published extensively trying to explain the bioethical reasoning behind the choice and how we see the ethics of international conferencing. But that really showed me how difficult it is to speak openly and respectfully across cultural, religious value systems. It requires, I think, a shift in how we approach our field. And I hope that this is the direction we will be going in. From human health to human flourishing. Even if we look at the very expansive definition of the WHO of human health, I sort of invite us to consider a more ambitious goal for bioethics and explore beyond human health the conditions for human flourishing. If I ask you whether bioethics should pay attention to factors such as race, ingenuity, gender, sexuality, disability in the context of healthcare, I think you would all say, of course. But how do these factors play out in human flourishing more broadly? I think a more ambitious bioethics, and that's the one I'm advocating for, should be about removing barriers to flourishing and building societies that promote it. So let me ask you this. Do you consider poverty, racism, war, global warming, misinformation? Do you consider these things themes that bioethics as a field should address? I'm guessing that most of you would say yes, because they're directly related to healthcare. But what about gun violence? What about domestic violence? What about homelessness? Challenges with housing? Threats to our democracy? Are these themes or challenges that bioethics should address? they're indirectly related to healthcare. Well, almost everything is indirectly related to healthcare. I would argue that yes, our field should reposition to see such challenges to human flourishing as central to our mission. Looking forward to the conversation around this. When I think about the Hastings Center specifically, it has been taking a very expansive approach to bioethics for many years. So I think if this is the future of bioethics, the Hastings Center is very well positioned, interestingly positioned to take on this vision, this challenge. From scholarship to impact. When I look at the work that we have been doing over decades, I see superb scholarship. I see a literary canon. I see well-established frameworks that have provided protections that enhance the well-being of individuals and communities. We definitely built a rich and nuanced knowledge base, conceptual and empirical. And many of us have used this expertise to contribute to decision-making. We sat on commissions and committees and advisory boards. Many of us also regularly engage with the media, trying to make bioethics more accessible to the general public and engage with the public. But at the end of the day, bioethics as a field is mainstream bioethics resides within the academic world. And that means that when more senior bioethicists think about training and mentoring the next generation, we worry also about our students and young colleagues and trainees, career progression and job security and promotions. And I think that because we are within academia, we still see scholarship as the core of our mission, and what I call, broadly speaking, impact as either peripheral or service component. Now, impact can mean many things. It can be policy development, implementation of recommendations, public engagement and education, media work. I would like to propose that such contributions should no longer be seen as peripheral to our mission, but rather become core considerations when we train bioethicists, formulate our research questions, write our grant proposals, and evaluate our achievements. How do we do that? Big challenge. But I think a critical part of our raison d'etre is impact, and it's time to acknowledge it. We saw during the pandemic how critically important this impact was. And I think it's time to reposition bioethics so that we can meet the challenges of impact. Now, to do all of this, I recognize that this is a very expansive vision, and that the challenge is, okay, is it doable? What would be the price tag of moving in these directions? I'd like to propose that to do this, we need to transition also from a field to a hub. I think we spent the last decades exploring very well within our territory, if I can use this metaphor. We delineated specialties such as clinical ethics, research ethics, public health ethics more recently. We identified subfields of interest like reproductive ethics, animal ethics, and now AI ethics. But I propose the metaphor of bioethics as a hub, as if we are now at the right time to build bridges from our territories outwards. I think that to expand our mission, we need more players, but not all these players necessarily need to define themselves, see themselves, or be seen by others as bioethicists. They can belong to those other disciplines and fields of inquiry that surround us. But we should now use the fact that we're known and well-positioned and that we have a history to become a convening power and to become this hub of thinking and activity that connects communities beyond interdisciplinarity. We've always been most of the time we have been interdisciplinary. The metaphor of a hub is meant to go beyond that, to invite us to become this convening power where a wide range of types of knowledge and value systems and expertise and stakeholders can sit around a table and use bioethical tools to engage in conversations about these huge challenges that are coming our way. So thank you, Bob, again for the invitation. I really want to discuss this. As I said, this is a vision that not necessarily everybody can align with or stand behind, but I think it's a good starting point to challenge ourselves to think about the future. And on each of these points that are still on the screen so that you can write them down or digest them further, I'm inviting a conversation. I think the Hastings Center mission has always been to some degree aligned with this expansive view. And I hope that the future of the field will allow a place for the Hastings Center to contribute to this repositioning. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback and thoughts on all of this.
Great. Well, thank you, Vardit. That's very exciting and a wonderful vision. And kudos to you for laying it out for us. We have a number of wonderful questions here. And please, everyone, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A section here. So Judy asks, what are the strategies needed to go global when international political tensions are intervening on all aspects of life? So given international political tensions, how do we overcome that?
Well, I didn't expect any less of Judy, just, a tiny and easy question. So look, I think I'm speaking to a mostly North American crowd, not just the hour and time zone challenges, but even the framing of this event. And I think it's time for at least the major players in the field, whether it's the Hastings Center or Bob, your center, there are so many strong players in the field today. I'm not going to start naming universities, but there are multiple. If each of us tried to identify global partners, to build capacity in resource-poor regions, this would gradually have a global effect. I think one thing we've learned is that change happens through relationships. It's not about me writing an essay about a vision and calling for attention to global issues. It's by us finding the partners that we have some common interest with, and enough common values to kickstart a real collaboration, a real partnership. So that these conversations actually happen. Over the last 2 years, what I have learned from the conversations with our partners in the Gulf region has been invaluable. I saw from the ground up how they frame issues, how they see bioethics, how they see the bioethics that we do, what they hope for locally, how they try to address their challenges. These are the conversations that we need to have to become global. The other thing is that almost all of us in this virtual age have an opportunity for mentorship. Many more junior bioethicists have been reaching out to me from parts of the world where they don't have a community, they don't have a center, they hardly have access to resources that we take for granted. And I have just been mentoring them and sort of opening up my networks or assisting in how do you write your first paper? How do you get funding? Who can become your support group? This is something that we can individually do to expand our own connections, but to really build capacity where it's needed. So Judy, just 2 ideas that are concrete and tangible, things that we can actually do. Of course, there are bigger things like hosting our conferences in places that are not the usual suspects, but I'll leave it at that and would invite other ideas.
So here's another potentially challenging question. How can those who live in poor countries, countries in which there are few human rights, countries in which a large population is starving or otherwise extremely disadvantaged, how can they begin to achieve human flourishing when they don't even have human health?
To a degree, you can ask this about the United States itself with access to healthcare. I know it's a totally different scale, but my point is that each region copes with some challenges to human flourishing. places, and we all know that positive rights are dependent on political structures and the level of resources that nations have, that governments have, and that cultures are willing to promote. So this is a very, very old philosophical question. But I think that once we recognize that the issue is not just health, and our mission, we see the scope as our mission, of our mission as broader, we can do more advocacy, provide more service, more support. I don't think that bioethics acknowledging human flourishing is gonna magically solve the tragedies everywhere on our planet. But I do believe that recognizing that flourishing, thriving, the right to benefit from science, the right to health, that all these things fall under the scope of our mission will allow us at least to argue, to advocate, to try to impact policy regarding these issues. I don't know if bioethics to date saw access to clean water as a bioethical issue. Maybe it shouldn't be, maybe it should, but as we define our scope, we give ourselves sort of permission to advocate locally and around the world for human rights more broadly.
Well said. Caitlin asks, what are the qualities or values necessary for human flourishing?
What are the
qualities or values necessary for human flourishing? What do we need to do to promote human flourishing, would you say?
Bob, are you really choosing just the easiest questions? Okay, there are many, of course, and I am not able to provide a comprehensive list, but I will throw two out there that I don't think stand in opposition, but are complementing each other. One is equity. I think that without recognizing the equal respect that human beings are owed everywhere, and I say equity, not equality, there's a substantial difference between the two. I'm not saying that everybody should be treated equally, but that we're owed in the healthcare context and in the context of human rights, the same level of respect. Once that drives our thinking globally, I think we've hit one nail. And when I say this, I'm thinking, of course, about the vaccine nationalism versus global vaccine equity debate that we're just emerging from. There were strong arguments on both sides, but I would love to see bioethics engaging in such debates under the banner of global equity. The other value I want to note is diversity. And as I said, people throw diversity, it's the hot button term. Everybody wants to do better. Everybody wants to promote diversity and inclusion. But what does it mean? And that raises the very challenging issue of who's around the table. What voices are a part of our conversation? I just attended a workshop on polygenic screening of embryos. And we looked at how some very radical groups in the US, white supremacists and racist groups, use genomics technologies to enhance their message and to feed into their ideologies. It's really scary, but that's a voice. Should that be included in the conversation? When I say diversity, how do we delineate the scope of the diverse voices that we want to include? It was so fascinating because the people in the room didn't even want to discuss the notion of such voices being included, and I totally understand. But who gets to decide the scope of diversity? Who decides what chairs are available around the table and what is the position of the various stakeholders? Between experts and the general public, between opposing ideologies, between religious and secular value systems. These are challenges. I don't have the answers, but I think that taking diversity seriously goes way beyond the discourse that we started having in North America. And I'm just inviting us to address diversity on a more global scale and look these challenges of who's included in the eye, not because everybody can always be around every table, but because to espouse the value of diversity, we need to do better in understanding what it is. So I just threw equity and diversity as two examples, but there are, of course, others.
Of course, you at least want to be aware that there are the voices of the white supremacists out there to know how to respond to those, it seems to me. So here's a different question. Congratulations on your new position at the Hastings Center. Any advice related with research ethics in Latin America about regulations when there are protocols from the USA or Europe that include people in our countries? And second, importantly, how can we collaborate with the center? Greetings from the Ecuadorian Bioethics Society. So, and we actually have a number of people I see from lower middle income countries. So how can they get more involved? Any suggestions or advice?
I'm gonna, apologies, but I'm gonna skip the research ethics question. It's not my main field of research or expertise. And I think the second question really allows me to extend an invitation to the world to engage with the Hastings Center. How to do it? Reach out to us. Tell us what you're doing. Tell us what your needs are. It's a beautiful opportunity to plug in some of the interesting things that started under the wonderful leadership of Millie Solomon, that just finished her presidency of the Hastings Center. For example, a summer school for bioethics scholars from underrepresented communities to sort of diversify the pipeline of bioethics career, not to just try and address issues of diversity later on in people's careers. Or scholars that are funded to do projects with us from low resource contexts. So the Hastings Center is very invested in actually finding mechanisms and platforms to build capacity. I don't know what I mean when I say elsewhere. Is elsewhere geographic? Is elsewhere a matter of resources or a matter of the identity of scholars and communities? All of the above. Now it's a small, with limited resources, we all have limited resources and we can't do everything. So priorities will be a big challenge going forward, but there is the desire to go global and to really assist where it's most needed. So it's a genuine call to reach out to us and try to engage. Not a promise that we can do everything right away with everybody, of course, but a genuine invitation to start a conversation about what partnerships can be built.
AI has been shown to reflect the personal biases of developers. What are ideas to ensure these are being addressed as they are being used in healthcare on a global scale? So I guess just you've worked in AI, which is very hot. Any thoughts on how AI fits in with what you've talked about, or what we might specifically be thinking about or should be thinking about with AI? Absolutely.
So first of all, it's we're already seeing the integration of certain AI tools into healthcare as we speak. Is it happening prematurely? Is it regulated enough? These are the hot questions that heads of healthcare systems all the way to individual physicians and clinicians are asking themselves. But I think everybody recognizes that bias in the data that feeds the algorithms is one of the greatest challenges. And the solution is, back to diversity, the solution is to diversify the data and to make sure the data that teaches the algorithms, the machines, is representative. AI is sort of a reflection of us, right? It knows what we teach it. Well, it doesn't know. It does what we teach it. So it's an opportunity to plug the beautiful initiative of the National Academy of Medicine in the US that convened a steering committee to look at how to responsibly and wisely integrate AI into healthcare at every level. This is not just at the bedside and not just electronic health records or how to run hospitals or how to do research. It's every aspect of healthcare. What should the US at this point do at the policy level, at the AI development and design level, the interaction between players? How can we create guardrails that will use the benefits of this incredible technology while as much as possible preventing the harms such as bias? We just started working, so stay tuned. But I think initiatives such as this should also go global. I'm sure many countries obviously have similar initiatives. Europe is moving fast in the direction of legislation. So everybody's working on it. But I want to point out again that some of the challenges will be global. Something like that at a global scale, and there are initiatives like that, of course, by international bodies. But this is a wonderful example of how parts of the world where we have more resources to develop these frameworks can then feed into the way other nations and governments do it while taking into account local values and local cultures. So that was maybe a bit of a meandering answer to a very complicated and currently hot question. But I just wanted to point out that the US is trying to promote several initiatives.
It's great. I wrote you getting bombarded with questions here. So, and everyone, please feel free to ask questions. And we've had some great questions, and please don't be shy in putting comments and reactions in the Q&A. Here's a question. Can you speak a bit more to what you mean by establishing bioethics as a hub that goes beyond interdisciplinary work or advocacy? So I guess drilling down a little bit on what that might look like.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting to look back at our history and how we have expanded in the sense of who belongs to mainstream bioethics. Because it really started out with philosophers, and then social scientists came in. And when I look today at a typical seminar that I teach, people come from so many different disciplines into the field of bioethics and build their careers later on in bioethics, but with different baggage, different disciplinary baggage. So one way of seeing the continued expansion of bioethics is to say, we will just keep including more and more disciplines. We will have, well, we already have anthropologists and political scientists and economists, but we just need to import more and more disciplinary views and make that bioethics. And yes, sometimes, but not necessarily. So when I talk about convening power, what I'm actually thinking about the model that the Hastings Center developed in some other places of creating working groups and thinking groups that engage multiple perspectives and diverse values in conversations on a challenge, on a topic, maybe with the hope of achieving a consensus, and if not, at least delineating the scope of the conversation and coming to an agreement or more clarity on certain issues. And I think if we stop thinking that everybody engaging in these conversations should be bioethicists, or that these conversations are within the scope of bioethics, we kind of liberate ourselves to invite into conversations led by us using our principles and tools to expand them to include others. And the others can be, well, we already started in this direction. Obviously, stakeholders outside of academic disciplines, patients. What about social advocacy groups of various types? Commercial entities. We've struggled with this. If we're talking about AI in healthcare, are we inviting Google and Microsoft to the table? They're not bioethics, but I would argue they need to be there. So the notion is that we use the tools we have developed for engagement and the richness, the internal interdisciplinary richness of our field, to not be scared to open up our conversations to those that will probably never be a part of our field, but should be, and back to the metaphorical table, should be around the table. So that's the notion of a hub. I think to a degree we have been doing it so far, but it doesn't, having these conversations doesn't necessitate that we expand our field in an infinite way to one day encompass all domains of knowledge. I think we've defined who we are, and now we have a solid identity based on which we can engage externally.
So here's a two-part question. I think that the second part is resonates with a few of the questions we've gotten. So to what extent is this bioethics going back to its roots and Potter's conception of global bioethics? And second part, how much pushback have you experienced and do you anticipate?
Fascinating. I think to a large degree, it goes back to the foundations. And this invites, people are already writing about what happened in the early days that the more clinically focused flavor of bioethics became so dominant. One thing that happened, for example, is that environmental ethics developed separately from bioethics. If we had grown together, maybe the field would have been different today. Is it time to reach now across? I mean, there are many fields of applied ethics, right? Do we now work with other fields of applied ethics? Do we recognize that we all belong, that we all need to develop a common toolbox? I'm not sure, but I think the answer is, to a great degree, the vision that I'm trying to, offer here does go back to some founding figures. And a lot of this will have to be developed going forward, but some of it can go back to literature that we've had for decades that sort of created a menu that we didn't really serve yet. And that's sort of comforting, the notion that when the field started, when the term bioethics was coined by Potter, he thought ecologically. He thought about humans in nature and human values and science in such a broad way. So it's very lovely, from my perspective, that we can go back to these writings to be inspired and now build upon that. The second question, Bob, was about...
Have you gotten pushback, or
Right.
if so, or do you anticipate any?
Yes, I am getting pushback, and I think it's very well intentioned. I think the notion is that we invested so much in developing the expertise that we now have. And there are enough challenges within the scope of current mainstream bioethics on one hand, and on the other hand, there are other disciplines that face other challenges. It's not up to us to solve all the problems of the world. So that's the type of pushback that I'm getting. And the notion of diluting our expertise and impact is a real concern. Am I right that bioethics should also work on housing and migration and gun violence? I don't know. I think that without developing tools to address these collective level issues, we will gradually become less impactful. But the pushback is really about our capacity, about focus, about effectiveness, and the risk of dilution. And these are valid, serious concerns.
How do we establish a presence for bioethics beyond the current parameters and venues? So should we be going beyond the academy, or where bioethics gets discussed? Are there other venues or where we should be involved or enter?
Absolutely, yes. And I think we're already there. Many of us are in the media, social media, podcasts, and definitely policy entities, advisory groups, commissions, etc. So I think we're already, for a long time, beyond academia. My point about scholarship to impact was that many of us see this as something that we do in our free time. We're scholars, we're researchers, and those who like it also do media, or those who are senior enough that they don't have to worry about their CV can do more committee work. And my push is to find a way, I'm not sure how, but to find a way to recognize those aspects of our work that are beyond academia. They're already there, but how do we make them more mainstream? How do we make them more core of the mission? And honestly, when my students ask me, how much should I invest early in my career? in such activities. I ethically encourage them, but I have to also warn them about neglecting their scholarship, publishing, grant work as a result. So it's a challenge that I face in my daily work with younger scholars. I encourage all of us to do as much as we can outside of academia. I think it's critically important, but I also encourage the field, especially more senior people like you, Bob, and those who head programs and have access to resources, to think about how to structure our training and our support for scholars in a way that would account for that these types of missions will be considered and valued, as I said, as much as scholarship.
So you're getting lots of praise, by the way, for your vision and your comments. So lots of thumbs up, so to speak. Someone writes, let us know how we could contribute to your vision. What would you say?
Wow, that's encouraging. So in recent years, for example, in my presidential address as the president of the International Association of Bioethics, I kept calling on bioethicists to try and pick topics that touch on justice, equity, global justice. And it's a challenge because, again, we're in academia and we often follow the money. We know that funding is often for the new shiny technology. It's very anticipatory governance of emerging tech. Everybody wants to fund CRISPR and gene editing of embryos that might or might not ever happen, but housing and poverty are less sexy. Sorry if I'm not allowed to use the word. So it's sort of a call to select what we focus on in a way. Of course, we have to worry about funding, and for example, the human genome LC program did so much for our field and produced incredible tools that serve us in other domains and built numerous careers. I'm not speaking against the funding for these topics. I'm just inviting those of us who can to remember to focus also on things that lead towards this vision, that address the topics that are more difficult to fund as researchers and that have this critically important, a critical contribution for the future of our field. I invite all of us to move towards impact, again, to the extent that we can. Don't be afraid to speak to the media. You published a great paper, turn it into an op-ed for a platform that is read not by hopefully hundreds, but by millions. Be creative in your thinking about how to disseminate your knowledge and your scholarship. Take a part in a public outreach event, organize one. Talk to other young or more senior scholars about how to organize such events. Get mentorship on how to write for the general public. So on each of the points that I included in this vision, each one of us can take small steps in that direction, in selecting what we work on, in selecting how we invest our energy outside of academia, and in expanding our partnerships a little bit beyond bioethics.
So a few questions about justice. So what exactly should people do? People have asked us in different ways, but just wondering if you could, many justice issues have bioethical overtones. How do we address these issues from a bioethical point of view?
So justice issues exist across the board. The obvious thing is to focus on justice within healthcare. Health disparities, social determinants of health, some notions that I already named. And this requires conceptual tools and frameworks that will feed into policy. When the time is right for policy changes, policymakers need something to fall back on. Concepts, norms, principles, frameworks. I think it's our job to provide those, by constantly developing and refining the tools that we have, the principles that we have for different contexts. So what does justice look like when you're allocating resources at the individual level, at the systemic level, national, international? We have done phenomenal work on these things, but I think almost everybody acknowledges that our tools are not refined enough and not rich enough. So one thing we can do is continue to do what we've been doing well, conceptual work that will create these tools that can then feed into policy changes, hopefully. The other thing is to start and understand within bioethics the different dimensions. So healthcare provision is one thing, but resource allocation, for example, happens between health and other resources. How do we advocate for resource allocation across society, accounting for health? So identifying the domains where justice needs to play a critical role for bioethics is another part of our mission. I know I'm answering at a very abstract level, but you know, this conversation could go in so many different directions that it's hard to know where to start.
I think that's a good start. Thank you. With the expansion of bioethics, what are some methods being looked into to help combat misinformation, especially when the misinformation is peddled by influential political and social figures? Any thoughts on that?
Wow.
1 minute now.
I think this is really one of the biggest questions that we have been facing in the last few years, and the pandemic, in a way, made things so much worse. I think in a way, bioethics has developed tools for delineating fact and value, opinion, perspective, evidence. We developed conceptual tools for dealing with trust. What does trustworthiness mean? How do we know what resources are trustworthy? What is the nature of expertise? So there are so many notions that are embedded in this issue of misinformation that we have been working on. So now, how do we use, refine, operationalize these notions of trustworthiness and diversity of perspectives and fact value to help decision makers, civil society, the media combat the terrible, tragic effects of misinformation? All I'm doing here is throwing around notions that many of us have been working on for decades. But I think if we take these notions and all the scholarly work that we've done and we ask ourselves, how can this be used to inform this fight against, we could discover some impactful ways, effective ways to help, at least in this ongoing this ongoing challenge.
What about lobbying? Someone writes here, should bioethicists be involved in lobbying? Is there a place in your vision for more aggressive tactics like lobbying? Because it seems like many of the issues that you're thinking about tackling are political by nature and require the type of fundamental restructuring intervention in the case of limiting what certain companies can do that can only be done through political bodies.
Another $1 million question. I think you're picking the hardest ones, Bob.
What's that? Well, I should just say, I feel like we're bombarding you with questions here and you're doing an amazing job. I mean, I think these are all areas that, you know, I think all of us need to start thinking about. I mean, I think your intent is to sort of create a conversation. I think not necessarily to have you come up with the answer, but
of course, I'm just joking.
No.
It's interesting to note that one of the perceived strengths of the Hastings Center is the fact that it's independent and nonpartisan. And I'm mentioning this because there is a huge risk of politicizing bioethics, and some of us aligning with one ideology and some with another, and almost to the point of polarizing and splitting the field itself. So I do caution against that. I think we can all find unity in notions of human rights and justice, and then how do we implement those in real life cases? We often disagree, of course. It's in our nature to disagree, and it's our job to refine arguments for multiple positions. Lobbying. I've been struggling with this for many years as a researcher. Early in my career, I started looking at the issue, for example, of the interests and rights of individuals conceived by sperm and egg donation. And I wrote quite a bit about the notion of knowing your genetic origins. So then I was approached by groups and advocates who worked to change the law in several countries to ban donor anonymity so that all children conceived via third-party assisted reproduction will have access to the identity of the donors. And they wanted me to advocate with them and for them based on my scholarship. And it's very tempting if you believe something very strongly to the point that you published on it for years, but it's also very dangerous to cross that line because you are a scholar. You're a normative scholar, you make normative arguments, but you need to keep some distance from the topics, the themes, the challenges that you're studying. I'm giving this as a sort of a remote example to say that, but I have many colleagues who have been writing on end of life and ended up sitting in committees and commissions that wrote laws to regulate the end of life. Is that advocacy? Is that lobbying? Is that policy making? It's very intricate. It's very complex. I think we should be very cautious about becoming straight out lobbyists, advocates. Can we do that in our private lives as citizens and then switch hats and become the independent scholar that is an arm? Very, very complicated questions. Many good bioethicists are passionate about the normative arguments that they're making, and they want to see change in the world. And I think it can be very tempting to cross the line and just say, this is now my life's mission, and I will use every political tool and every lobbying tool that I have to see the law changed. And I'm staying away from current political issues in the U.S. Like it's fire, because but you sometimes you sit around a table, you think everybody agrees, but they don't. You think you know how everybody voted, but you don't. So crossing these lines can be very dangerous for our field, while recognizing that we often make strong normative arguments that easily feed into one side of the political map and not the other. Complex question, complex answer, sorry.
On that question and a number of the others, it'd be great to set up a future webinar with you or with others, have a panel sort of discuss these kinds of issues. In other words, the question, should bioethicists be more involved in policy in some way? If so, how? I think what you just said is terrific, and the question is terrific, but really it could be the beginning of a much larger conversation with different people may have different views and take different approaches toward it. So here's another question. Global always raises the specter of colonialism. How can this be addressed?
Well, I think I hinted in that direction when I talked about taking diversity seriously. I think sometimes when we think global, we think, oh, let us, the enlightened, progressive, bioethics from the global north, bring our light and our wisdom to areas that from where we stand we see as, they're not yet where we are. And this, of course, going back to research ethics, this has been fed by the NIH funding research around the world and showing up with its own set of standards. And I'm not saying it wasn't justified. It's all about the protection of participants under someone's funding and under a certain body's funding, and that's absolutely legitimate and justified. But what is the message when bioethics norms are sort of exported or seen locally as imposed rather than growing from the bottom up in different local contexts? So, going back to the Congress that will happen in June in Qatar, do we show up with the posture of, you don't understand human rights, you don't understand autonomy, we're bringing an international conference to your location to educate you, to enlighten you? It's a posture, really, versus you face your own challenges, you have framings that are maybe foreign to us but are clear to you. Let's engage in an exchange, an authentic, honest exchange across our viewpoints. It's not easy, but to me, this is the way to address that fear of global bioethics is just another iteration of colonial thinking and exporting values, exporting/imposing values. I think it's a matter, again, some of it is relationship building, because when you really know someone at a professional, personal level, you start to understand the world from where they stand and how they frame values and how they see tensions. You also understand their local limitations to impact change. There are examples of people who were very well-intentioned that ended up causing damage locally because they brought attention to something. There were grassroots groups who were trying to gradually and in a sensitive way implement change, and external forces came with, big ideals and brought attention in a way that took those groups back. So there are dangers in global bioethics, and I think we cannot be sensitive enough, listening, engaging locally, and acknowledging that other people are doing important work elsewhere. And we need to start by listening and understanding, and then see what we can contribute to each other, not us to them.
Well said. Do you have any advice for students to help them prepare to advance the field of bioethics? Or just advice to students, to young people entering the field?
When I started, when I received my first big grant to do a study, I had a moment of panic because I realized that to do the work well, I need to be a social scientist, a statistician, a health economist, a narrative expert, obviously an expert in qualitative methodologies. I could not be all these things, obviously. So I started creating the group that would do this work together. So I think the earlier in your career that you recognize that you can't do it alone, and that you give up on the crazy ambition to have expertise in all the domains that you will need to succeed, but rather start to build your network and your trusted collaborators. Collaboration takes a lot of trust, and it takes time. So I think my best advice is, don't try to do it all. You will drown. Recognize your main interest and your main passion, build your capacity there. And when you recognize what challenges you want to address, collect the people around you that complement the needs that you will have to effectively address this challenge, and build these relationships to be lifelong. Most interesting, innovative, groundbreaking work that I see around me is done by groups, by teams, by collaborations, by partnerships. So that's one of the best things that you can do early in your career.
So here's a question about the International Association of Bioethics decisions about Qatar. And someone writes from Costa Rica that it's surprising to me the board reacted as if we, those who disagree, were attacking the board. Many of us have been caricatured as not supporting the decision. Aren't we supposed to be open? How should they express their disagreement?
I'm actually glad that this is coming up, because it's such a great opportunity to explain that it was never the intention of the board or any of the authors on any of the papers to attack, criticize, silence, none of that. everything we wrote was meant to invite an even broader and more inclusive conversation. That is the reason that after publishing elsewhere, we went to the American Journal of Bioethics, where the invitation to converse is structured because everybody's invited to submit a commentary on what you wrote. So we absolutely understand the concerns, even fears. We totally get the criticism. Some on the board criticize certain aspects themselves. We have a long-standing collaboration with FAB, with the Feminist Approaches to Bioethics network that is hosting in conjunction with the World Congress. There was never an intention to do any of that. If anything that we wrote or said in the media was read in that way, then we were misunderstood. So that's why I welcome the opportunity to clarify that beyond any doubt. We invite these voices because I think we're all looking for the right way to go where we haven't gone before, to engage with communities that we haven't engaged with, to help those facing human rights violations cope locally with their challenges. I think we need to distinguish between governments and academic entities that host us. So this is, again, an invitation to converse about this because this challenge is not going away. A part of what we wrote is which country cannot be criticized for some aspects of how it handles the provision of healthcare, immigration. I'm not going to start on the list, but we all face challenges, some countries more than others, and global and diverse should be global and diverse. So how do we do this right? It's an invitation to think together about how to do this better.
So how do we get the public more involved in bioethics? You mentioned the media. There are other ways we should engage them more?
To me, everything that we write scholarly is an opportunity to expand public understanding. So I already called on people to think, to put this public engagement hat on as often as you can. Some of the stuff we produce is very abstract and very difficult to disseminate or to translate. But some of it, journalists are looking for the interesting angles. Everybody is, or their family is a patient. The work that I do on AI, much of it is still premature or very difficult to communicate, but I'm constantly trying to find a niche, an angle, a very narrow topic that everybody can relate to, because everybody's concerned about algorithms reading their mammography or an algorithm writing their healthcare record, right? It's visceral. We want to know who's involved in our healthcare and whether it's to our benefit and what are the threats to our privacy. So if I manage to take a small piece of what I'm doing and write about it on public platforms, respond to journalists in a timely fashion, all this trickles. Sometimes one piece that we write ends up being replicated by 100 other venues. It's time consuming. It's sometimes scary because you're quoted out of context or you get criticized for what you wrote. I understand the concerns, but we face opportunities to impact public engagement and public education daily. Let's identify them and let's use them. Which is why, again, the part of the vision that says pay more attention to impact says also when you mentor young scholars, invite them to pay attention to this all the time. Train them to think about it as an inherent part of the knowledge creation that they're doing more naturally.
Well said. You're holding up well. We have just a bit of time left. And again, please feel free to ask questions. So here's a question. Thanks for thought-provoking vision, which a lot of people have said. Focusing on the collective level or global benefit can require individuals to give of themselves altruistically. This is easy to support and understand ethically, but it does not seem consistent with the mood of the country or the world. Beyond having conversations, how do you think this mind shift can practically be implemented at a time when we can barely even have civil discourse?
Well, I should have started by saying this is aspirational and inspirational. But of course, through policy, I mean, we can all be altruists at an individual level and try to do our best. But I think eventually the notion is that bioethics work can and should try to impact policy in these directions of attention to global equity, etc. How we translate our work to impact policy, that's, again, one more long-standing issue, and some of us are experts in that particular field. But that would be overall my answer.
And I should say again, just to remind everyone, because I feel like we're putting you on the spot here to a certain degree. I think these are the beginnings of conversations of the things you've been saying. I mean, obviously, all Vardit's comments, I think, are laying out land that I think needs to be further explored and probed. But you're doing, I think, a great job pointing us in directions that I think need to be taken or should be taken or taken more than they are now. A question about I'm looking for it about fertility and infertility and what's going on with that and with women's rights. I'm wondering if you might comment on some. I know it's an area that you do wonderful work on in terms of reproduction.
It's so interesting because when I look at the field of reproductive ethics, it's almost as if we're constantly being pulled in two opposite directions. I'm not going to touch abortion. I really choose not to in this format. But I was just asked to comment yesterday on the pronatalism movement and the notion that, oh, our species is going to become extinct because we're not having enough children. So we have an ethical responsibility to have more children. And on the other side of the spectrum, oh, every child that you have has such a carbon footprint that it's totally irresponsible to reproduce with climate change. What we should do is, as many of us should, sacrifice maybe our desire for reproduction and not have children. So it's almost humorous how ethical arguments are being used and counter arguments are being used in two ways. In my own field of prenatal genetic testing, we're again seeing this push and pull. We have the ability now to know so much about the fetus, about the in vitro embryo. So some of the field says, oh, that creates an obligation to use these technologies to know more about future people so that we can responsibly select who gets to be born. And other people look at that view and say, oh, that's good old-fashioned eugenics. We need to promote the freedom of everybody to have the child that they want. So that disability perspectives are represented and protected in society. I wouldn't call it polarized, but there's a lot of tension between competing. I won't call them opposing, because sometimes you can reach an interesting point in the middle, but competing views of how we should use reproductive technologies, genomics technologies in reproduction responsibly. So I think a lot of work remains to be done on the topic of fertility. Sorry, Bob, but we're facing a global crisis in male fertility that is declining very, very fast. And some think the solution is to create sperm from, somatic cells, which opens up another Pandora's box. So I think anybody working in reproductive ethics will be busy for many years to come, not just because of the new technologies that emerge almost every day, artificial wombs, artificial gametes, etc., but also because of the context, because even things like climate change impact how we look at reproduction, and definitely these technologies impact how we see families and relationships. So if this sounds like an invitation to join us in the field of reproductive ethics, I guess it is.
A few questions about the role of religion. So because you mentioned human flourishing, religion, as you mentioned, was involved in bioethics early on, to some degrees less. What should be the role of religion going forward?
We've been thinking about it in the context of the International Association of Bioethics because we're international. Billions of people around the world see their lives through that lens. And since they see the world and their own lives and their family through that lens, they also approach healthcare in that way. That includes patients and also clinicians. Bioethics in the US, for very good reasons, mainstream bioethics sees itself as, I was going to use the term secular, but what I mean is not grounded in religious commitments, okay? But what does that mean when we want to be inclusive, hear voices, again, listen genuinely and authentically to voices, and many of these voices are framing bioethical tensions through religious frameworks. So I talked so much about the proverbial table and who is around the table and what voices are heard. I think that if we exclude any religious views because mainstream bioethics is not about religion, we're not hearing. We're not hearing what matters to people. We're not hearing what matters to communities. So I'm not, this is not a call for theology to dominate bioethics, but it's a call to recognize that if we're taking diversity seriously, it includes the actual worldviews that nourish people's ways of approaching the bioethical dilemmas in their own lives and in the lives of their communities. Oh, you're muted, Bob.
Given the expansive nature of the field that you're laying out, should we change the name bioethics?
Wow, that's another big one. So, it's very funny because when I wrote the essay, I wanted to give an example of an emerging field, and I wrote AI ethics, and then I paused and said, no, this is AI health ethics. And then I said to myself, no, you're trying to be more expansive, so it is AI ethics. So indeed, what does the bio mean? Is the biomedical, as it has been? Is it more Peterian? Is it just the biosphere and the ecosystem? And do we even want to limit ourselves to bio, or do we want to become the ethics of human flourishing? I'm not sure what we would change it with. Another issue is branding. I mean, we spent decades building a brand, building a field. We're better known. It's not that everybody knows what bioethics means, but we are recognized under that label. So there's always a cost in that level of change. I personally really like bioethics, and I think it's just a matter of, under that name, how inclusive and expansive we want to be. And I still think the term bio can include much more than it has included in the past decades.
Someone asked about getting a copy of your article, so I don't know when it will be available, and can we send a link?
So it's unpublished. I guess this is a sneak preview, but it's the September-October issue of the Hastings Center report, and I promise to send it around. It will be on social media, of course. I'll send it around as much as possible. And
Great.
the editor will be very pleased that you asked.
Yes. We just have a few minutes left. I know we barrage you with questions. Are there other thoughts you have about or responses to some of these issues? Or there's a few other questions I can ask, but just so I'd see if, are there particular questions you have for the audience that you would like answers for within this or within any of these domains? Or
I'm genuinely inviting reactions. So I presented 4 points, as I said, it's sort of paradoxical, because if I'm speaking infinitely about inclusion and diversity, the views that reject some of them also should be included, right? So I genuinely invite, I know I may regret this, but even emails, messages with, you think I have a blind spot, or the vision is risky because there's a price tag that we haven't identified this evening, or here's another point that's missing. I genuinely invite this feedback because, well, the Hastings Center will engage in an exercise of priority setting in the next few months. And while this is about the future of bioethics, broadly speaking, I think we're also going to be asking ourselves, what is our role in this? So every argument that nuances these points or calls to limit this expansive vision to something more manageable would actually be taken into account and will be impactful. So I'm inviting that.
One other set of questions, maybe the last question here, comes up with the systems level issue. So someone wrote early on, it has never been about who gets the kidney or the ventilator. It's rather why was the supply limited? And that focus made the question of kidney dialysis disappear as a challenge, similar with ventilators. And a few people asked about national health insurance in the United States and pointed out that I guess Dan Callahan even was against it early on. So the health system in the US, changeable, ways we might get more involved in changing it, thoughts about that, important, not important, what would you say?
I'll stay at a very high level of human rights, equity, right to health, issues of access, which, point in a certain direction, but I'm not going to say more. I'm going to turn it back to you, Bob, because you recently hosted a seminar where we brought together Canadian and American scholars to compare and contrast the two systems and to see what lessons can be learned from one to the other. I'm sure this is still available online. So I think that could provide a very interesting starting point to thinking about this. I don't want to make political statements. It's not my place, and it's not the objective of the conversation tonight. But again, I think if we look at a certain set of values, it points us in certain directions.
And someone wrote, who is a person with a Greek back name, last I think they're Greek, said, the etymology of bio is life. So all life and living beings would be in bioethics. I think it's a nice reminder of the Greek root. And he actually wrote it in Greek, what the letters are. May we have Ms. Ravitsky's email? I'll let you just, we're going to send out.
Absolutely. It's on the website of the Hastings Center, and absolutely.
Great. With that, we're actually out of time. So, Vardit, thank you so much. What a wonderful vision. It's so terrific that the Hastings Center has you as the president and that you'll have an opportunity to pursue this vision in all kinds of ways. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It was a fabulous discussion. And I think it lays out, obviously, lots of terrain, lots of questions for further discussion and debate. And Vardit, you really done a fabulous job guiding us through some of these. Just a reminder, by the way, first of all, we'll be sending out a video of this event, so you can have that or share that. We have some other wonderful events here from our program at Columbia. A info session about our program, but also a wonderful panel on Islam and bioethics coming up on 10/26. I think many of us feel that Islam, which has, as Vardit was reminding us, billions of people around the world who are Muslim and have different perspectives on bioethics that I think are important for us to understand. 2 decades of progress getting medical interpretation right. And translation, and the ethics of telemental health, challenges and dilemmas and opportunities. So, and please also check out the Hastings Center, which has wonderful materials that constantly update on their website, which is terrific. So again, Vardit, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to being in touch. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.